Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. As we begin to take a look at what happened on January 6th, including the wholly inadequate response and who knew what and when, tonight we begin by spending the first half of our program discussing the first leg in this probe, that's security failures, and today's hearing.
I received chemical burns to my face that still have not healed to this day. I witnessed officers being knocked to the ground and hit with various objects that were thrown by rioters.
That's a first-hand account of the violence on January 6th as Trump supporters stormed the Capitol. Well, today we had the first of many congressional hearings that are going to focus on the riot, and today they spoke about the security failures. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to take a look at what was going on during the riot and also the politics involved. But we begin tonight here with the lead up to the rally, intelligence failures and questions about why law enforcement was not more prepared. I want to kick things off with a man who led the Capitol Police Force on January 6th, but stepped down the day after. I'm talking about Stephen Sund, and here he is talking about the intel that they had before the siege.
It was very similar to the intelligence assessments that we had for the November and December MAGA marches. The intelligence assessments that we had developed for the January 6th event all the way up until January 6th, we're all saying very much the same thing, and that's what we had planned for. We had planned for the possibility of violence, the possibility of some people being armed, not the possibility of a coordinated military-style attack involving thousands against the Capitol.
The acting chief of the Metro D.C. Police Force also spoke when it came to intelligence. In addition, Sund added more about what they knew before the attack took place.
I think that the intelligence did not make it where it needed to be. We received it in the form of an email that came as an alert bulletin at 7 o'clock p.m. the day before. I would certainly think that something as violent as an insurrection in the Capitol would warrant a phone call or something.
I think it was more than just the Norfolk letter. I think we need to look at the whole entire intelligence community and the view they have on some of the domestic extremists and the effect that they have. I look at this as an intelligence problem that impacted this event.
Now, they are talking about the explicit warnings that were issued by the FBI field office in Virginia on January 5th, warning that extremists were planning to travel to D.C. and they were going to get violent. And it quotes some of the online chatter, including plotters saying, and I'm quoting here, "Stop calling this a march or rally or protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die. Nothing else will achieve this goal." Post goes on to say the Virginia field office shared the information with their counterparts in Washington. Sund, he was asked if the Capitol Police got that report. Listen to his response.
The United States Capitol Police Department did get that report. I was just advised of that in the last 24 hours. That report made it from the Joint Terrorism Task Force over to our Intelligence Bureau, over to a sergeant there, and ceased moving forward at that point. No leadership, myself included, over at Capitol Police was made aware of that at the time of the event.
All right, a lot to unpack here. Let's bring in our guest to discuss. Former FBI agent Michael German. Michael, we talk about the failures. Was this a failure of intelligence, or was this a failure of acting on intelligence? Because, I remember, leading up to 9/11, bin Laden determined to attack U.S., and we made a decision not to move on that. But, this was open chatter. We're not talking about cloak and dagger spydom here. They were talking openly about this. So where was the failure?
I think the failure goes back for years, where the FBI and Department of Justice and state and local law enforcement have been deprioritizing the investigation and prosecution of white supremacist and far-right militant violence. And even today, when you look through the complaints that the Justice Department has filed, they're focusing on January as if it's a standalone event, as if these were groups that came to protest and the attack happened spontaneously, rather than acknowledging that many of these groups and individuals had engaged in violent activities at public protests for the last 4 years, with very little policing from the locals and no follow-up very little follow-up from the FBI when they traveled interstate to engage in this violence. And as you say, the hearing focused on this one Norfolk, Virginia FBI memo, but this was discussed openly in plain sight. It's under no circumstances is there a justification for not having prepared for the attack.
Okay, Michael, neither you or I saw the presidential daily briefing that day, but what makes this tragedy so exceptional is these people were recruited, invited, and incited at an event that the president chose, both the timing, the day of the certification, and the location, obviously walking distance from the Capitol, let alone they were appointed. So my question is this: since this was a slow-moving boil, as you described, am I not being conspiratorial to think somebody had to tell the administration, let alone the White House, you got a lot of nuts that are coming on January 6th, and they're coming armed to bear. You guys better be careful with the rhetoric or whatever we're doing, let alone maybe calling the thing off. My point is, when the president and the Rudy Giulianis and the Donnie Jr.'s got to the stage that day, isn't it reasonable to think that they were saying, a lot of the folks gathered in front of you, they got bad intentions today, be careful?
I think that over the last 4 years, it's been the opposite, that they were painting the people that these far-right militants were attacking as the problem. You know, what Donald Trump referred to as Antifa, and Attorney General Barr directed the FBI and the Justice Department to prosecute those Antifa groups perhaps as terrorists, even though that wasn't really what was going on here. So when I hear the people testifying today talking about how the intelligence was the same at the November and December events, their preparations may have been less than they needed to be, because they were expecting them to attack the same people they had attacked those previous rallies, which aren't people that these law enforcement agencies care as much about. And perhaps they were surprised. They shouldn't have been, because far-right militants in Oregon attacked the Oregon State Capitol just 2 weeks prior, breaching the doors, fighting with police officers, attacking journalists. So it's hard to understand how they couldn't have realized this was a threat to them directly and was an escalating issue over the last several months.
So then, Michael, and I know these questions are going to be coming up in the subsequent hearings, but I didn't get an answer for it today. So now all hell breaks loose, and they quickly know they can't hold the line, they're overwhelmed. Explain again to me how the National Guard wasn't, racing through those doors right away. I still didn't get a suitable answer as to who asked for what, and frankly, I don't care if Sun made a call, and the Sergeant at Arms didn't get it or whatever else. Why wasn't the White House saying, send everything you get the cavalry to Capitol Hill? I still didn't get any rational answer why that didn't happen for hours.
And I think we have to be careful about focusing on the National Guard. There are plenty of federal law enforcement officials in D.C., right? You have the Park Police, and if you've ever lived in Washington, D.C., and seen the Park Police clear a protest from a park, that type of aggression is not what we saw during this much more serious attack than any of the protests we've seen. So there were law enforcement resources that could have been brought up as well. So it is very difficult to understand how, once they did realize this was a specific attack on the Capitol, that they weren't able to muster law enforcement elements to come in and protect the Capitol, particularly to protect the people in the Capitol.
Finally, Michael, we're going to get to the bottom of who knew what and when, and I asked it because I listened to the inanity of, well, I called them at 1:09, I didn't have any, there's no record on my phone. There are, as they say, receipts, and we're going to be able to figure out who made calls to whom in the lead up and then during the riots, and who chose or didn't choose to send the requisite help. Are you confident from your intel background that that's going to get out?
I think there's plenty of information. You know, how it gets out and when it gets out is really critical, because they can twist the narrative based on selectively released facts while withholding other facts. And right now we see the Justice Department pressuring Congress for a new domestic terrorism law as if they needed more authority rather than simply changing their policies and practices about who they use their existing authorities against. And I think that's what needs to be examined, is why this far-right violence over the last 4 years wasn't better policed. There was a report in the Atlantic in October, months before, that highlighted how many people claiming a law enforcement background among applicants to the Oath Keeper. So I'd like to know, what did federal law enforcement do about this public report that people purporting to be FBI, Secret Service, ICE, federal law enforcement authorities were part of this insurrectionist group, or any other groups? Again, this goes back for a long time. My report, Hidden in Plain Sight, on the racism, white supremacy, and far-right militancy in law enforcement, came out the previous month. So this was a problem that was in plain sight, and we need to know why law enforcement wasn't reacting to it.
And again, I'm going to stress that this wasn't some organic event that came out of nowhere. This was an event specifically designed for the date and the location, and then directed to the Capitol. So the organizers and the speakers of the event, including the former president, knew very well who they were talking to. And I got to think, with access to the best intelligence that we have, they were probably alerted as to just the percolating dangers sitting in front of them that day. But Michael, I appreciate the time as always today. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, folks, when we come back, much more from today's hearing, including all the finger pointing, there was plenty of it, about why the National Guard wasn't called in sooner. We'll be right back.